Day 1260 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzie here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So starting off, we'll take a look at those Russian losses, as currently Russia sits on more than 1,060,000 military personnel losses, representing an additional 1,040 in the past day. Then as for hardware, 4 tanks, 4 APVs, 47 artillery, a multiple launch rocket system, and 1 oil refinery. A successful strike. So across to the map we go, where Ukraine has intensified its summer drone campaign with this latest operation, UAVs that struck the Ifipsky oil refinery in Russia's Krasnodar region. The direct hit was on one of the refinery's distillation units, igniting a massive blaze that continued to burn into the day for a crucial facility that processes 6.25 million tons of oil annually, most of it for Russia's domestic use, thereby being fuel essential for both Russian military operations and the Kremlin's economic stability. While the full extent of the damage is still being assessed, it has led to, unsurprisingly, a halt to operations at the facility. This incident now marks the 4th reported attack on the Ifipsky refinery since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion, and for an event that also marks the 3rd successful strike on unique Russian oil refineries this month alone, and likely deliberate timing too, with this latest strike coming within 48 hours of Putin's announcement that a ceasefire would come only after the Ukrainian military withdrew from their southern and eastern sovereign territories, and for Ukraine to abandon their aspirations of joining NATO, all terms that Ukraine is not willing to accept. So the situation is shaping up to show that Ukraine is re-energizing its UAV strikes on oil refineries after Ukraine entered into 3 successive rounds of good faith peace negotiations with Russia, becoming a lengthy period where the AFU's one-way attack drones that were operating against these critical Russian assets that ceased specifically from April to June. However, following the closure of the 3rd round of direct bilateral talks between the two countries, it became evident that Russia was negotiating in bad faith with intentions not for peace, but rather a strategic pivot aimed solely at halting Ukrainian UAV attacks on its oil infrastructure, all while continuing its invasion. Good for Russia, their delay tactics worked for a little bit, but this can only ever last so long, especially with Ukraine's patience wearing thin, alongside its increase in military aerial strike capabilities as time presses on. And now there looks to be more stalling Russian tactics on the horizon, but I'll get into that shortly. Then on the map, and if that wasn't enough for Krasnodar, Ukraine struck an artillery brigade base located in Slavyansk with military unit 61661 reported to take a direct hit, and then added to the Krasnodar chaos, Russian coastal defenses were engaged in repelling a naval drone assault near Novorossiysk, the strategic port city just south of the refinery. Sirens were blaring across the coastline, indicating activated air defense efforts, with reports of numerous explosions. Although the consequences of the inbound USVs are still being clarified, for the base of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, becoming the main base since last year, after numerous successful Ukrainian campaigns forced a significant naval withdrawal from the occupied Crimean Sevastopol base. It was just far too close for comfort. Now to the main map, where we saw a bit of consolidation from Russian forces on former grey zone areas over the past 24 hours. Udachne, which is part of the Pokrovsk sector west of the town itself, which saw this activity, along with Novomykhailivka just south of it. As of now, for the region, Ukraine's general staff most recently commented, stating that the Ukrainian Defense Forces continue to hold back Russian occupiers around the Pokrovsk-Myrnograd agglomeration, and going on to say that for over a year now, the enemy has been unsuccessfully trying to push their forces out of this area. So where we are to go back in time to precisely a year ago, you see that Russian forces were just 20 kilometers out on their approach to Pokrovsk, as they encroached upon this territory from the southeast. So to reach this level of gains a year later is far from a military flex, especially as it's not even a consistent pace seen around the entirety of the map, lacking a 20-kilometer pace of movement in other regions. But even if that were to be the the case, that means there would still be 600 odd kilometers to go, and that'd be just to the Kyiv capital. But the Kremlin remains convinced that they've still got this one in the bag. Then to move to the southeastern direction of Tolstoy, with invading forces forgetting Zelenyahay at the foremost leading positions northwest of this sector, instead taking a rear entry headed north to take the wider flank route. This has been spoken about previously, where Russia would have some significant challenges pushing head on due to the terrain and close quarters urban combat they were coming into. Beyond this immediate point on the map, it then becomes a case of the Russian armed forces having to contend with the Vovcha River just as much as having to contend with the Ukrainian army. Then in taking a look around the map, coming across the vaporization of a fully loaded Russian BM-21 Grad MLRS. They pack a lot of firepower to blanket an area with, but being ex-Soviet systems, they're running out of volume, and once they're gone, the jig is up. In recent years, Russia pivoted to the production of newer Uragan 1M multiple rocket launchers, but you've probably never heard of them, reason being, less than a dozen have ever been produced, as they're simply far too expensive for Russia to produce, at around $1.5 to $2 million a unit, with them now living somewhere between the prototype and serial production phase with severely limited deployment. Only seen once in Ukraine, likely for combat testing, and yes, it was destroyed. Also on the map, and to some of the unsung heroes of Ukrainian air defense, with a mobile firing unit sporting heavy MGs equipped with a thermal sighting device. These types of crews account for the outer point defenses of the multi-layered air defense network, and though they're less dynamic than what's afforded in range and flexibility of a traditional missile, or even that of an interceptor drone these days, they still hold their own, just like this one, spotting and intercepting a Shahed attack drone that was on a flight path close to its own position. Now to the news, as Vladimir Putin has expressed a desire to meet Donald Trump, as conveyed by US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff during his recent Moscow visit. Putin's message was relayed to Trump, who has indicated readiness for a meeting as soon as next week if it could help end the war in Ukraine. This potential summit, however, raises eyebrows given the current geopolitical climate and the ongoing conflict, but with this latest Kremlin offering coming with a caveat. The US is still preparing to implement secondary sanctions against Russia, signaling that pressure remains firmly in place. President Trump, while expressing optimism about the talks, has warned that sanctions will proceed if no concrete outcomes emerge. As for a Trump-Putin meeting location, options are being narrowed down. Neutral or friendly nations like Turkey, China, or Saudi Arabia are under consideration, but venues such as Switzerland, Rome, Germany, in fact, most of Europe, the West, and 125 countries in total, all but ruled out at this point due to Putin's International Criminal Court arrest warrant. But to get down to brass tacks here, the Kremlin dangling the carrot of direct face-to-face talks between Putin and Trump looks to be yet another game of stalling by the Kremlin. For a few reasons, because the Kremlin, or in this case Putin, would likely just claim at the last moment that such a meetup would only be the first in a series of meetings, with the first not designed to get into any such high-level discussions on ending the war, thereby leading to a follow-up meeting or war in weeks or even months ahead. So have we not seen this playbook before? The Kremlin using this type of rhetoric and strategy, which should be considered to be, well, obvious by this point. It should also be mentioned that everybody already knows Moscow's position anyway. It's been parroted repeatedly by the Kremlin, and then just a couple of days ago it came direct from the horse's mouth, with the Russian Tsar reaffirming his only interest in a ceasefire if Ukraine's military backs out of their own sovereign lands, in an ongoing case of one land, two constitutions, with Russia deciding to update their own not long after the war commenced. But ultimately, Putin's best outcome here would be to use these talks to stop Ukraine's use of their own UAVs and their upcoming deployment of homegrown ballistic missiles, to politically stop Ukraine from using these weapons against critical targets deep behind Russian lines. And if Russia could achieve that outcome again, like they did earlier this year, then they'd prevent Ukraine from striking back in the domain that will hurt Russia the most: air. air, all while Russia would continue their invasion on the ground. But at least this time around, it will be a trick that's much more difficult for Moscow to pull off. And now to follow up this news with some Russian hardware news, as we don't see a lot of the following these days: cited instances of Russia moving heavy equipment into the SMO, with this latest armoured convoy spotted coming from Russia's east, which includes a number of old T-62 tanks, not that many, clearly refurbished, with the remainder being BMP-1 infantry fighting vehicles with additional protection kits. I'm guessing it took an even greater deal of effort than in past batches to piece these ones together from their own crumbling Soviet stocks, refurbishing them, and adding the drone cages on top. Actually, I like to refer to these as drone huts, and these designs have shown themselves to be wildly ineffective in battle. It's almost as if there's no meaningful dialogue between SMO participants and refurb centers, or no dialogue at all. Then to some Russian economy news. Difficult to know where to start with this, with a lot of companies in the red or down on profits, but firstly, the largest cement producer in Russia is switching to a 4-day work week for its employees. The reason is a record drop in demand in the domestic market and an increase in the share of imported cement. Earlier to this news, leading Russian automakers switched their employees to shortened 4-day workweek schedules as well, due to precisely the same reasons: a drop in domestic demand and a flood of cheaper import alternatives, combined with a flood of cheaper import alternatives. In fact, sanctions have sent car manufacturing of most Russian automakers back to the 20th century, selling cars without airbags, air conditioning, or even radios on standard entry-level cars, with some of these components not even included on their higher-end models. It was the CEO of Russian automaker AutoVAZ that commented on the change recently to say, quote, "People don't really need an air conditioning unit when driving." So it's top-level industry attitudes like these that will further crush their auto industry, with Russian civilians headed directly to the Chinese car alternatives, with Moscow having little in the way of options to ban the imports or add additional sales taxes, because then he'd have to answer to Xi Jinping, who, well, despite the country of China professing neutrality in this war, its economic cooperation with Russia amid Western sanctions, at least indirectly, aids the Russian war effort. It's not missiles, but it is machine tools and quadcopter FPVs. Meanwhile, in some economy news, Russia's oil revenues fell in July, specifically with oil tax revenues down 33% from a year earlier, and where total oil and gas revenues fell 27%. The decline was attributed to falling global prices and ongoing sanctions pressure, but it's not all bad news for the Russian economy, because we do have, for example, Russia's funeral services market, which has posted double-digit growth in the first half of 2025, as revenues grew by 16%, or $501 million US. Alongside these figures, the number of newly registered companies in this booming industry rose by almost 20% compared to the same first two-quarter period from last year. But that's only half the story, because it's worth noting that a significant portion of this industry still operates off the books due to scant state regulation, lack of government oversight, and being a pervasive criminal domain in Russia for many decades, marked by widespread bribery and unreported cash transactions. But in some ways, this booming market sector will always leave a considerable share of the industry's potential profits that will remain forever stuck in Ukrainian soil, if you catch my drift. So that's it for today, guys. Thanks again for watching. Please continue to like, comment, subscribe, and I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers!